Now for a response from the Democratic side of the aisle, let's bring in Congressman Khanna, who is a member of the House Oversight Committee. He joins us from Mountain View, California. Congressman, first, your take on the top-line conclusions from the Attorney General's letter.
Well, Brett, I agree with Kevin McCarthy. We need to put the country first. But the biggest thing is to look at Mueller's conclusion that the Russians interfered in our election. He said that the Russian Defense Agency hacked into the Democratic Party. He said that the Russians manipulated social media. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, we should come together to make sure that kind of interference doesn't happen and make sure we're strengthening our intelligence platforms and our Internet platforms to prevent this from ever happening again.
So do you agree with Leader McCarthy that he says, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, that it's a good thing for America that Special Counsel Mueller did not find anybody in the Trump campaign or tied to the Trump campaign who colluded or cooperated or conspired with Russia?
Well, I need to read the whole report, but I have tremendous confidence in the Mueller investigation, and my sense is that there was definitely a finding that the Russians intervened. I mean, you can say that no one in the Trump campaign coordinated or conspired, and if that was his conclusion, I take him at face value. But what we can't ignore is that there was an interference in our election. There was a reason the Russians wanted the Trump campaign to win, and wholly a part of whether Trump conspired is a question of what we're going to do to make sure that never happens again.
Okay, I want you to listen to your colleague, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, on Face the Nation.
The American people deserve to know whether Donald Trump is either A, a legitimate president, B, a Russian asset, C, the functional equivalent of an organized crime boss, or D, just a useful idiot who happens to have been victimized by the greatest collection of coincidences in the history of the Republic.
So, Congressman, can you say it's A, that he's a legitimate president?
Well, he was elected by the American people, and he is the president. And I think what we ought to be focused on is what we can do for the American people. Let's pass an infrastructure bill. Let's deal with prescription drugs. Let's make sure America wins the green energy race. You know, China is out there making all these investments. What are we doing for the country? That's why I was elected to Congress, and that's what I hope we can focus on these next 2 years.
I guess what I'm getting at, Congressman, is do you agree that some people on your side of the aisle went over their skis in some of the characterizations that the president was a puppet of Vladimir Putin, considering what the special counsel has found today?
Well, Brett, all I can do is speak for myself. I always said that I had confidence in Bob Mueller. We should wait for the Mueller report, and we should look for the Mueller report and not make conclusions before the Mueller report. And that's what we should do as responsible members of Congress. So I can't speak for other people's characterizations, but I do think that there is an opportunity to come together around the election interference, and we should salute Bob Mueller for his extraordinary work there. I mean, he indicted 12 people, 12 Russian agents. Any American should be concerned about Russians' interference in our election, in the UK, and around the world.
Last thing, there are calls for the entire report to be released on Capitol Hill. There are obviously parts of that report that deal with grand juries, grand jury interviews that legal experts say should not be put out there, and obviously classified information. How do you see this ending up, wrapping up?
Well, even Leader McCarthy voted to have the full report become public. It was a 420-0 vote. Obviously, you can't disclose classified information. No one is calling for that. You can't disclose information before a grand jury. But other than that, the entire report should be made public. And I think that will help the country assess the facts for themselves.
Congressman Khanna from California. Congressman, we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Brett.
There is at least one socialist running, or one avowed socialist running for the Democratic nomination. There might be others. The party does seem to be moving certainly toward in that direction. I suppose the fear that some people have is, especially someone like Kamala Harris probably has, is that while it may appeal to a lot of Democratic voters, it may not appeal in the general election. Can a socialist get elected president of the United States?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders can get elected in the United States, and part of his appeal is this anti-establishment appeal, and it's very hard if you map it to other countries. Why is the most left-wing candidate doing better with centrist voters in, let's say, in 2016 than he did with Democratic Party primary voters? And I think simply because a lot of people in the United States who call themselves centrists or moderates, in fact, aren't really moderates. They believe in a more expansive welfare state. They believe in these things we've associated with the left in other countries. They just don't really have that language. They don't like liberals, so they say that I don't like the Democratic Party, so I'm not a liberal. They don't like the Republican Party, say I don't like the Republican Party, I'm not conservative. So they just say I'm a centrist. But that doesn't mean they're Ezra Klein, Andrew Sullivan centrists. It means that they I think just are fed up and discontent with the political class in this country.
And Ryan, there does seem to be, although people might think socialism is just not possible, socialists couldn't get elected, the country that you and I come from has a Labour Party, which is officially the opposition, but it's led by a man called Jeremy Corbyn, who is, I think probably, we'd agree, the most left-wing leader the Labour Party's ever had, certainly in the last 100 years or so. He managed to achieve for the Labour Party at the last election in 2017 the best improvement in the Labour Party vote. He got more of the vote than Tony Blair, an avowed centrist, of course, got when he ran the party. So it does look as though it's not the kind of electoral suicide, socialism, and by the way, the Labour Party right now is led by someone who's essentially a Marxist. It's not the electoral suicide that people used to think it was.
Well, I think a lot of that election was about Brexit, and also I think a lot of people voted...
Let's not go there, please.
I think a lot of people voted for Jeremy Corbyn because they didn't think he would win the election, paradoxically, so I don't think he'd do as well in an election, though who knows. But I think there's a bit of a Trojan horse here, right? When Busker and others talk, and Bernie Sanders talk, they talk about the social democratic components of their platform. They talk about expanding the generosity of the welfare state, providing more in the way of healthcare, and these are things that many social democratic countries do. What they don't talk about is the more socialistic aspects, these forcing companies to become worker cooperatives or mutuals or all these other different forms of organisation. And I think those areas, if you look around the world and historically, they're the real areas where you can do some real severe economic damage to the economy.
Is that really the plan? Is this all a Trojan horse for kind of like real genuine workers' Soviets?
No, I think that we need to start with what works, and I think social democracy works and it's proven. Now, social democracy does have a Trojan horse in it, which is that it's reliant on the profits of capital. It's reliant on business investment. And at any moment, businesses can say, we don't like this regime, we're going to pull the plug and have capital flight, or at least just withhold investment until you roll back regulations, until you roll back the welfare state. Now, a way around that is the creation of a sector that is based in cooperatives, that is based in worker ownership. Now, that's up to people then and there to have that fight and have that debate and decide, do we want to advance further down the road of social democracy or do we want to stop? It's not relevant for the next 10, 20 years.
We're going to have to wrap, but just very quickly, both of you, my impression talking to Republicans is that they're actually licking their lips at the prospects of fighting the election next year against the Socialist Party. Ryan?
I think that's absolutely right. I think Donald Trump would love to run against an avowed socialist.
Is that wrong?
Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the country and he would win a general election.
Well, that's very clear. We have a very clear delineation there, and we'll see. We've got plenty of time to discuss these issues. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. In economic policy these days, it seems conventional wisdom is more conventional than wise. Not so long ago, we also used to think that socialism was a very alien, un-American concept. Other countries in Europe, Asia and Latin America might like government ownership of large parts of the economy, high taxes and a very big and comfortable welfare net. But the US, with its strong culture of individualism, its anti-state origins, would surely never embrace socialism. Well, maybe we've got to rethink that. Polls show that a significant number of Americans would like to give socialism a try. A majority of Democrats, according to some polls, identify as socialists. And many of the party's most vocal leaders and advocates, including at least one of the frontrunners for the Democratic nomination next year, are avowed socialists. Why this change in the political weather? Well, this week we're going to take a deep look at socialism and ask, what is it? And why is it suddenly popular on the American left? Is it really an improvement on the capitalism that seems to be the bedrock of American prosperity through this country's history? Joining me now to discuss all this is Bhaskar Sunkara. He's editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine and author of a new book, The Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. Also with me, Ryan Bourne. He's an economist at the Cato Institute, a libertarian institution, and he's an avowed capitalist. Bhaskar, if I may start with you. Let's understand what we're talking about. What, in very simple and brief terms, is your understanding of socialism?
Well, socialism believes that too much of life today is accidents of birth. And we believe that people should have, at the very least, the core necessities to reach their true full potential. So for me, that means a society in which childcare, housing, education, basic access to nutrition are no longer held hostage to the market, but instead are guaranteed as social rights. And more generally, I think we believe that democracy is a good thing, and democracy should be, to whatever extent possible, extended from just the purely formal political realm into more social and economic spheres as well.
The traditional understanding, the dictionary definition of socialism, is government control, government ownership of the means of production, distribution, exchange, which means essentially no real private, very limited private property, and the government essentially runs everything. That's not quite what you're describing, though.
No, I think there's certain natural monopolies. I think there's certain things like even health insurance that should be run by the government. But I think there's other spheres where we should strive for different forms of ownership, like worker ownership, ownership through cooperatives, and things like that. So we should think about our ends, not necessarily the means of nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy and all these old mantras.
Is there a model, a country either now in the world or that there has been in history that you could point to that, if not is a perfect model of socialism, then it gets to the kind of system that you're trying to reach?
Well, I think Sweden in the late 1960s and the 1970s, in fact, eroded the tyranny, what I think can be the tyranny of capital, to the point that if you were born a Swede, no matter what part of the country you were born, no matter your parents' background, you were at least guaranteed a certain bedrock of rights that allowed you to reach your potential. Now, I would go even deeper than that, and I would start to ask questions about why workers can't exercise more control over their work. Why can't there be more democratic representative bodies, even beyond trade unions, at work? But I think that achieves and checks most of the boxes that I have of a good society.
Right, Sweden seems like a nice place. I don't know if you've been there, but seems to work reasonably well. It does seem to have a fairer distribution of income and wealth. Why shouldn't the United States be more like Sweden?
Well, it's worth bearing in mind that if you look at Sweden's economic history, between 1975 and 1995, roughly the period that Bhaskar's outlining here, the Swedish average growth rate was around 1.6% a year. Since it has adopted a more capitalist, market-friendly model after the reforms in the 1990s, its growth rate has ticked up to 2.5%. So already I think you're seeing that trade-off. Socialism comes with very, very lofty aspirations, but the messy reality of government planning, whether that be planning from the central state level or having kind of advisors and experts overseeing worker democratic institutions, as we saw in Yugoslavia, Venezuela in the early stages of that revolution, the messy reality seems to be that it does harm economic efficiency and ultimately then raises less in the way of revenues for governments to redistribute in the first place.
Bhaskar, that does seem to be the pattern, doesn't it? That it, again, kind of nice idea and fairer distribution, but there does seem to be a trade-off between reducing inequality and achieving faster growth. That does seem to be the record in Europe, for example, right now.
I don't think that's exactly true. Let's say in the Swedish case, to use that example. In fact, having workers demand higher wages force businesses to be more competitive, to invest in capital goods, and not just, in the United States we have all these low-wage industries that are sustained because of the fact that workers in the U.S. don't have the bargaining power they do in Europe. So if you're actually for things like automation, if you're for things like a more dynamic economy, if you're for this creative destruction, I think it can be done best with higher wage demands from workers and with a safety net to help people after the fact.
Right.
Well, that can happen for individual firms. If there's price pressure on your labour costs, you can invest in labour-saving technologies. That doesn't necessarily mean at an economy-wide level it will work. And one thing that I would say is if you look back historically to the early 20th century, unionisation rates and the power of labour was much more powerful both in the UK and Germany than the United States, but average wages were much lower. Why? Because those economies were much less productive, and ultimately it's productivity that leads to faster wage growth.